Black Doctors Podcast.
Hello and welcome back to the Black Doctors Podcast. I am Steven, your host. This week we're going to hear from Dr. David Miles. He is a Naval veteran and he's a pediatrician currently practicing in Maryland. So of course we're going to learn about his pathway into medicine and his practice as an active duty service member, who's taking care of pediatrics in the military, and why would a military physician practice in the peds specialty. Before we get into that, we are coming off of one of the highlights of medical education. Last week, this is March, and it was match day. So a week ago, Monday, those emails went out that stated that you matched or didn't, and then there was a SOAP process, and then finally people opened up those envelopes and saw that they had matched to their residency programs. So excited for you all as you step out and begin this next phase of your journey. And we are here to help you, to support you in this next phase. If you go back, there's episodes that talk about being successful in residency, different things you should watch out for, the good, the bad, the ugly. And a lot of the purpose of this podcast is to provide that institutional knowledge, both to pre-medical students, to medical students, and to residents. There's a plethora of attending physicians, and they share their thoughts and their perspectives, a bunch of attendings that work with residents. So just a wealth of information for you here on the Black Doctors Podcast. We are so excited for you to start this journey. For fourth year medical students, we are going to be, I wouldn't call it a scholarship, but as I know all too well, and as you will soon find out if you're a fourth year medical student, it's tough to finish medical school and then to move across the country and start this residency program. There's financial implications. It's going to be stressful. There's family stuff that comes up. You got to have healthcare, all these different things. And, you're about to start some of the hardest 3, 4, or 5 years of your life in graduate medical education. So the least we can do in the podcast is we're going to provide some scholarships. And I personally hate scholarships, the scholarships that make you write essays and all that stuff. But so it shouldn't be that time and labor intensive. But we're going to select 4 people, 4 fourth year medical students that are heading off to residency, and we're going to provide some financial aid to you. It's not going to be a lot. We know we're not really bringing in that much money, but every little bit helps, and having some extra cash will definitely help as you prepare and schedule these moves. Otherwise, for you fourth year medical students that have finished up, essentially, well, you're not done yet. You got a couple more months, whether they expect you to show up on the wards or not, but you still got to finish up medical school. You got graduation, which I do recommend going to. It was always kind of up in the air for me. I almost didn't attend my medical school graduation, but I'm so glad I did, because it's just fun to have that ceremony to close that chapter of your life. But as you're looking forward to moving in June and starting residency, there's a couple things to consider, and what can you start doing now? One, you got to look at your relocation priorities. So the excitement of match day is going to wear off, and then you got to realize you're moving somewhere to a new city. You got to start scoping out the apartments you're going to, rent, or are you going to try and purchase a house? But that's kind of where you can start with your next phase of planning relocation. Where are you going to live? How far from the hospital? Those minutes really start to add up when you're working your 24-hour shifts. If you can just slide out the door and make it to the hospital in 10 to 15 minutes, usually you're traveling at times that a lot of other people aren't on the road, or at least when you're going in for your shift, you're going in early. And if you're off early in the afternoon, for whatever reason, then you may get stuck in rush hour traffic. So that's something to consider as you're looking at where you're going to live. You have a couple months left in medical school, so make sure you maximize that, learn as much as you can, things that will help you as you know you've matched into a specific specialty, you can start to tailor the things that you learn and tailor the next couple of months to helping you be successful as an intern. Look at your budget. Shortly after match, you should get a contract from your residency program that will spell out your salary. That should probably talk about your healthcare insurance, but you'll have a number that you can start building that budget and use that as you're looking at where you're going to live, because you don't want that additional stress of being broker on top of residency stressors. And of course, enjoy your free time. It is totally worth it to go on that week-long vacation, that 2-week vacation. You may go in the hole and may impact your finances. You may be paying it off for a long time, but it's nice to just go out with your classmates or whatever. I think a group of us went to Rome in Barcelona as fourth-year medical students from Howard. I have no idea how we paid for that trip. We were staying, 2 or 3 people in a room. That was a different time. You couldn't be an influencer and make all the money that you folks are making these days. But that trip was 100% worth it. I would do it again. I was just in the Bahamas. No, I was just in Jamaica, actually, with that group of friends, and we've stayed close ever since. The final thing I'd recommend is, shortly after you get done celebrating, start planning ahead for step 3. That's the last little bit of your medical licensing, and ideally just go ahead and knock that out. You still have that knowledge base from residency, so you can use that to your advantage. Sometimes you'll have to get your school to be proactive about kind of submitting the paperwork that states that you're eligible to take the test. So definitely take care of that as soon as possible. If you have a slow block early on, try to get that, in the late summer or in the fall, so you can study for and take the USMLE step 3 and just have that behind you. As always, we are here to help on the Black Doctors podcast. We'll probably schedule some episodes about mental health. We'll have Dr. Bush back and talk about planning for starting residency. And stay tuned for additional information on how we're going to decide, which 4 listeners are able to receive some financial help as you plan for this next phase in your life and you begin to travel and move for residency programs. I also want to mention the advice residency. So I follow Tyler Olson. He is a financial planner on Twitter, and him and I think 14 or 15 other physicians and people from various backgrounds, financial planners, locums agencies, lawyers, a bunch of finance gurus who are also physicians, rather. And they're going to have an advice residency. I think it's actually this week, but you can go to adviceresidency.com/match. You can also just follow Tyler Olson on Twitter, find out about their programming, putting together a really fantastic group where you can learn a lot of stuff. Not sponsored, but I think that's very helpful for folks that are in their 3rd year, 4th year of medical school, and even residents, and financial literacy is so huge to continuing down that pathway of freedom. So congratulations again to all the 4th year medical students that matched. And for those of you that unfortunately did not match, you keep your head up. You got this. Things happen for a reason. It's oftentimes very difficult to deal with, but you will get through to the other side. We're going to jump into the first half of an episode featuring Dr. David Miles and his story, and then come back next week for the rest. Hello, welcome back to the Black Doctors podcast. I am Stephen, your host. Privileged to host Dr. David Miles, one of my fellow shipmates, former Naval officer and a pediatrician currently practicing in Maryland. Dr. Miles, welcome to the show.
Thanks for having me, Dr. Bradley. So good to be here.
Yeah, awesome. I'm usually pretty informal, so feel free to call me Steven if I can call you David.
That works. That's actually my brother's name, so it's going to work out really well.
Right on. So thanks. And I'm always thrilled, flattered, excited when people that I don't know reach out to come on the podcast. I do a lot of cold calling, cold emails for people that I know from medical school or residency, but we have not met until a couple minutes ago. But I read some of your story and I'm excited to share that with the listeners.
Glad to be here. You know better than I, the sort of dearth, though growing number of Black physicians was certainly linked up during medical school, but in the professional side, it's hard to maintain those connections to organizations like the student or the National Medical Association, of which I was a part of the student part. But I'm so happy to be here and glad for the work that you do.
Fantastic. Well, as we mentioned, you are a pediatrician, you're a military veteran, but we'll start at the beginning and kind of talk about your pathway into medicine.
Certainly. It's in some ways a dream deferred. I mentioned briefly that I had a grandfather who served in World War II, used the GI Bill to come out, pay for college, as well as get a house. And he was a solid student, but at the time, for African Americans, there were few options for Black folks to attend medical school in large numbers. And they were primarily limited to your alma mater, Howard University, as well as Meharry.
Yeah.
And you, back at that time, had to be pretty stellar to get into those because of supply and demand curve. So he ended up being a milkman for a number of years, saved up his money, and then got into essentially property management, owned a few buildings, and that's how he made his living as a landlord. Being a landlord, you have to fix things, and he wasn't the best, bless his heart, at fixing stuff, but did have a guy that helped out who my dad worked under. My dad got really good with his hands, and as a kid would spend a lot of time with my dad working around the buildings on weekends, and he asked me what I would want to be when I grew up, and I said, do what you do. And he said, well, you're pretty good with your hands. Why don't you consider being a doctor? That's the first time a seed was planted. We had nobody in our family who was in medicine. So without any path laid out, I just did what I thought I was supposed to do, biology major and so on and so forth. And after getting into medical school, the decision then was, well, what type of physician to be? My mother is a retired school teacher and started at the 8th grade, worked her way down all the way to kindergarten, pre-K. And she would always state, if it's so much easier to set a kid on the right path and intervene later in life. So, and I used to hang out in her classroom, mentor kids. And so that's how getting into pediatrics was a good fit for me. So started Morehouse and Yale for med school and then Hopkins for residency. And then I joined the Navy backwards while in residency. But it was a great decision. Got to see a good chunk of Central and South America while doing some good work in Camp Lejeune.
It's fantastic. I share in that I joined during residency and didn't reap the full financial benefits of serving in the Navy. So a question that I get a lot is military medicine. We have, it's not just active duty service members. They think it's a full population of just healthy young men. Obviously, there's young women, there's kids, there's babies being delivered in Camp Lejeune. Can you talk about, well, first, let's talk about why you joined the Navy.
Well, I won't lie. I think we probably came up around the same time. I used to watch a lot of ESPN in middle and high school, and they would invariably have those Marines commercials. That's hugely proud of the many. I thought if I ever would serve, I would serve with them because they would seem to be the most hardcore, great uniforms. At the time I joined, the realization that the Marines did not have their own medical corps. The Marines are a department of the Navy, so hence the Navy. I was told by other people that the Navy has better bases, which is true. They're on the coast, places I'd like to be. I had a lot of Navy and Army folks in my family, but that's why. And I really was interested in doing humanitarian work. In fact, I actually applied for this humanitarian assistance disaster response fellowship that they had in the Navy, got it, but because of sequestration, budget shenanigans in Washington, they didn't have funding for it. But it was really, I think, the ability to use the military diplomatically to provide a service for a host country is much better, in my opinion, use of resources than to drop bombs or what have you. So that was primarily why. I mean, I just like military. I was inspired when the earthquake that hit Haiti in 2010, they lost lots of infrastructure, including their executive building and hospitals. The Navy sit down this hospital ship, the USNS Comfort's about 1,000 beds. And and so every time there was a task that came up, I would volunteer, and ultimately got to work with Continuing Promise, which is a humanitarian mission in 13 countries in Central, South America, and the Caribbean.
Wow. So that takes us to your practice in the Navy. So for people, you're a pediatrician at a Marine base. Can you tell us about your patient population and like what that work was like?
You bring up several points, and I think we should make it more explicit as you're doing for the audience. I currently work at a military hospital now as a civilian. People say, well, are there kids in the military? Obviously not, but certainly active duty service members do have families, as you alluded to. They're married, have children. And Camp Lejeune is an interesting place. It's primarily enlisted Marines. So these are, I would say, late adolescents, kids often out of high school who sign up, go to Parris Island boot camp for a while, and then their first assignment, in some instances, is Camp Lejeune. So 18, 19, 20-year-olds who, for better or worse, I think the military as a sidebar is a great way for kids who need some direction, can be helpful. Very few kids, 18, 19 years old, can show up on time, well-dressed, ready to serve. And the military does instill that level of responsibility. And to that, many of them are married. A good chunk of them are married with kids at age 19, 20 years old with a car note and everything. And at Camp Lejeune, historically, it was a place that was only male service members, or primarily male service members. That's changed over the years. And as opposed to having a lot of bars and tattoo parlors, they have Walmart and Chuck E. Cheese now, so it's catering to the burgeoning.
They still have their tattoo parlors and the strip clubs and the car lots.
That's true. Those are still there. I guess what I'm speaking to, there's not a whole heck of a lot to do out there, so they have a lot of kids. It's just, I think at the time or just after I left, it was the busiest Navy military hospital. Wow. It went from Naval Hospital Camp Lejeune to Naval Medical Center Camp Lejeune just because of numbers. I think they were working or may have recently completed the new hospital since I've left. They certainly just finished up the Peds clinic, but it was hopping. It was lots of patients, lots of babies, great teaching. And it was as close as we'll ever be as being a Marine.
You had residents there?
Yes, there was a family medicine program, so I got to do some teaching, although the primary goal is to, as they say, churn and burn. So see lots of patients from 8 o'clock in the morning to 4 p.m. But there was a residency component and program there. And I actually enjoyed teaching more than I thought. The residents in the family medicine program were often older than I was, had more experience, prior listed. So as much as I was teaching the pediatrics, they were teaching me other things, military life and others, dealing with adults and such. Because to be truthful, a lot of our Camp Lejeune or just enlisted service members are just late adolescents, 18, 19 years old, which are kids that I saw during my pediatric training. I would see up to age 26. So it was arranged. It was great. It was great medicine. I enjoyed being there.
What was it like to be a Black male physician? You're an officer as well. What was that like working with the families, that predominantly enlisted population, as well as the patients?
Great question. But perhaps some of the listening audience may not know, people who serve in the military you have disproportionate representation of minorities. So you have, whereas African Americans might comprise 9 to 10% of the population, it's higher than that in the military. So in the teens, similar to Latino Americans and so on and so forth. So it wasn't as much of a culture shock in that regard. Again, many of these families are enlisted. So we have kids come from all across the country, rural America, which is overrepresented, as well as minorities who've lived together in basic training. So that part of the feeling as a sore thumb sticking out wasn't unusual. Although it was brought to my attention when I had family visit. My mom was really impressed so every time you come through the gate, you have to show your ID. And because I was an officer and the folks at the gate were enlisted, they would always salute me. And my mom was like, oh, that's cool. I took it for granted. But she grew up they had to flee the South, right? They came up in the 50s and such. So it was powerful for her to see that. And even among the enlisted, there are a couple that I took under my wing, one of whom I still mentor today, enlisted Marine who is, I think, Latino American, who was interested in medicine, so would do some shadowing. He's actually now in his second year of law school, worked with him over the years. So it was a great opportunity to mentor folks. People see me as a person of color and as an officer. It inspired some confidence in them. And like I said, it was great from a mentorship opportunity. Fast forward to where I work now. at Walter Reed. Minorities in the officer ranks are, I wouldn't say a dime a dozen, but it's much more pervasive. I saw today, 06, a captain in the Navy, African-American woman. And those are still unicorns, but that's probably the second or third I've seen, where we had maybe 106. Yeah, 106 in the entire base at Camp Lejeune. Yeah,
like you mentioned, the distribution where we are overly represented, especially in the enlisted ranks, the higher, just like in academia, the higher you go in terms of the rank structure, the fewer of us are usually around. And so it was, I remember, very rewarding to be able to provide that mentorship to people that looked like me, or to provide that support or letters of recommendation, just whatever I could to the enlisted folks I worked with.
Great points. Yep.
So you mentioned a couple of different deployments that came up, and you joined thinking about the hospital ship, the USNS Comfort. I was able to spend some time on that ship as well, 5 months. But tell us about your deployment, your Continuing Promise mission.
It was the first that they resumed. This is 2015, I believe, if I'm getting my years right. Yeah, 2015, CP-15, because I think they scrapped the one for 2013. So they're usually 6-month deployments. Because they scrapped the one in 2014, we won an extra month. Going to, again, it's largely diplomacy, and then medicine is secondary. But the medicine was cool. Again, it's a hospital ship, as you recall. There are radiological capabilities. It's X-ray, CT scan, I believe we had as well. There are operating rooms. And so as a general pediatrician, I was often sent out to, for example, first stop we had was in Belize. So I spent 10 days living in Belize in a tent by night, and during day just seeing 30, 40, 50 patients, basically doing general health assessments. There was a lot of earwax removal, which I like procedures. But then finding those patients, I think I saw a wild type chickenpox, which we grew up having chickenpox. I hadn't seen it in years because we have immunizations here. So rheumatic heart, what I presume was rheumatic heart disease, untreated strep infection. We don't have that here because we over-medicate patients, way too many antibiotics here in the country. But to see the sequelae of untreated strep infection as manifested in the heart, we had the ability to do cardiac echoes so we can see the lung lesions and the heart lesions. And then for those kids who, for example, may have an undescended testicle or something like that, we could refer them back to the ship to get a repair. So while we're doing the medical part, we also had what's called the construction battalion, or the CBs, that would go out and do things like help maybe paint a school or fix an air conditioner or something like that. Then you had the subject matter exchanges, where we perhaps would reach out to whatever health facility they had there to discuss a topic. And then they would also teach us a topic. I will say, in going to some of the countries, Jamaica, Cuba, this was the first time we actually had a contact with Cuban folk in, I think, since the embargo, which was great. We were there right one time the Pope was there. But when you go to places like Cuba, Jamaica, where there's not as much reliance upon tests and such, you have to be really good with your clinical skills of observation. It was great to learn from them. I spent time working or learning in a hospital in Jamaica, as an example, Bustamante in Kingston, about how they, for example, manage asthma, which is different from how they send folks home with just prophylactic steroids to be used at the onset of wheezing type symptoms, whereas here you'd have to come to the clinic and such. But it was just interesting to see how different places practice medicine. And as much as I thought I was helping out, I probably learned a lot more on my own by reaching out and working with the host country and the medical professionals they had there.
Yeah. You echo so many of my experiences when you're on a ship in the middle of a bay or whatever, trying to do surgery, and you really figure out, what do I need for an anesthetic versus what will be nice to have. And that translates to later in life. You don't need all the bells and whistles. You can just make it happen safely.
Exactly.
How many stops how many countries did you go to on that trip?
So I think we did missions in 13 countries, but we stopped in 15, some to refuel and such. Most of Central America, with the exception of Costa Rica, didn't do Mexico, which I guess is North America, but all the Central American countries, and all the way down to Colombia in South America, went through the Panama Canal twice and did a number of islands, Jamaica, Haiti, Dominican Republic. I'm missing a couple. So we just stopped in Barbados to fuel. That's and then we stopped in one other island where we didn't do anything, but We weren't doing anything medical, but we did Dominica, which became a huge favorite. I didn't realize how beautiful the place was, but I'm forgetting a few. But it was also interesting to be there. We went to Honduras and Guatemala, the places from which, even at the time, but certainly still going on, a lot of migration happening from those countries. At the time we were there, it was the murder capitals of the world. So as we would go to these places to set up shop to see patients, we'd have literally people with assault rifles for force protection to make sure we were out there. There are 50 cal machine guns on the ship, as it were. Some of the things that broke my heart being in Haiti we had a patient who died. So there was news about the hospital ship coming. People would wait in lines like overnight, days in advance. And it was summertime, it was hot. And this presumably young child born premature, just was dehydrated. Mom was near cachectic because she wasn't getting enough nutrition, so couldn't do much in the way of breastfeeding. And by the time it got to us, was agonal breathing and expired. That broke my heart, among others. And then the number of cases that we weren't able to put on the ship because of a variety of reasons, liability and such. Those still haunt me to this day.
Yeah, those were, I remember, tough decisions and resources and triage as if people were too advanced or we didn't have the capabilities to safely provide care, then we weren't able to treat everybody that came. Right. Yeah. So David, let me ask you, reflecting on your time in on active duty in the service, what was the highlight of your time?
I mean, just bread and butter, getting good at my job. I was fresh out of residency, so I knew a lot, but being turned on my own, having to make my own decisions, there was no attending necessarily to run to. Grew up fast in that regard, developed confidence. And then it was working with resources. Again, Camp Lejeune's in the middle of nowhere, North Carolina, right on the coast, but the closest big city is Wilmington, Research Triangle, like Raleigh, Durham's like two and a half hours away. So being comfortable with what you could manage and with when you need to call for help, for a lifeline to one of the tertiary quaternary care centers, recognizing that you couldn't always pick up the phone and get an ambulance and come 2.5 hours out. So you had to figure out how to make do there. Another thing that the interest that started there was recognizing we didn't have really good mental health resources. So a lot of the kids we would have to send out in town, and some of the providers out in town weren't doing things that we thought was consistent with how kids should be managed. So working with a child and adolescent psychiatrist who was tasked to see adults, but worked out a deal where she could come see some of our kids, maybe a half day every other week, and then help us on our own to improve screening, diagnosis, and treatment of kids with mental health disorders because of the lack of mental health resources out in the community was something that I really became interested in, and it followed me thereafter. And thankfully, I had, an interest then, because fast forward to now where kids are dealing with the pandemic, still have that huge shortage of mental health providers. It's incumbent upon primary care providers, pediatricians, family physicians, internists, to be able to manage straightforward anxiety, depression, so on and so forth. So becoming more comfortable with that and getting the practice of medicine, particularly outpatient general ambulatory medicine, more comfortable with, again, assessing, diagnosing, and treating those behavior disorders is something that interest that developed and continues to this day.
And we'll stop there for this week on the Black Doctors Podcast. Thank you so much to Dr. David Miles for coming on the show. I've learned so much from our conversation already, and it was good to reconnect with a shipmate, a fellow Navy veteran. Tune in next week for the second half, where we're going to be talking more specifically about mental health issues and opioid abuse in pediatrics. And we talk about this is interesting because Dr. Miles is not a child and adolescent psychiatrist. He's a general pediatrician, essentially, who over time has begin to fill this niche. So this is something that we can all do in our different specialties. Within reason, you can always do more and find these different passion projects and niches in medicine. So tune in next week to hear all about that. Thank you for tuning in to Black Doctors Podcast. We're here because representation matters.